Between 1519 and 1865, during the European Transatlantic Slave Trade, at least 1.8 million Africans were thrown into the sea and perished under horrendous conditions on the 2-month voyage. Within a span of about 350 years, over 13 million slaves were transported in about 12,000 ships across the Atlantic Ocean on an estimated 40,000 slave trading voyages. Also referred to as the European-American slave trade, the trade commodity consisted of mostly Africans from the western and central regions of the continent. Some of these slaves were captured by the European slave traders or had been sold off by their fellow Africans through tribal war conquest or kidnappings for the purpose of the trade. These slaves were usually bound together in shackles and placed aboard cargo ships in very inhumane living conditions. So dehumanizing was the act that slaves were advertised on handbills just like mere goods made during slave auctions. This episode tells the full history of the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese were not only the first to buy humans as slaves in the 16th century, but was the nation with the highest trade volume, followed by other European nations such as France and Spain. They were also among the last nations to succumb to the abolition of the trade and were responsible for transporting about 40% of slaves by the end of the trade. They began the trade by successfully transporting a ship full of slaves to Brazil in 1526. This opened the doorway for many other cargo ships and the transportation of thousands of slaves. These slaves were given different jobs when they got to the homes of owners who had bought them. The Western world had begun agricultural developments comprising a wide expanse of land for plantations. These plantations consisted of sugar, cotton, cocoa, tobacco, and so on. Some of these slaves were assigned to work on these plantations, while some worked as household servants. The Portuguese did not carry out this trade without the help of Africans. After unsuccessfully trying to carry out raids and kidnaps by themselves, they employed the services of Africans who would capture slaves and transport them to the coast to be sold. They also formed business relationships with African leaders who would readily provide the foreigners with their fellow Africans captured from conquest, along with other raw materials like gold. The Portuguese dominated the slave trade for over 200 years by monopolizing their relationship with the African leaders, thereby hindering access for other European countries. With time, the French and English found ways of acquiring slaves as well. Sometimes they would capture Portuguese ships carrying African slaves, leading to a hostile takeover. The Portuguese had initially partnered with Spain to get involved in the slave trade business. The latter eventually broke out of the partnership and granted access to other European countries to purchase slaves directly from the African merchants. By the end of the 18th century, the British had become the highest slave traders. The Middle Passage was the route through which the cargo ships transported the slaves. This voyage usually took 6 to 8 weeks to complete, during which many of the slaves died due to the deplorable conditions they were left in. The space allocated to the men was just enough for them to be in a crouching or sleeping position. The women and children were put in a different place, although less deplorable than the men. But they were exposed to sexual harassment and molestation. The hold in which they were kept stank, and with little or no ventilation, many were bound to die. Diseases such as dysentery and smallpox were rampant, and some slaves also had to deal with seasickness. Food was greatly rationed and served twice a day. People who refused to eat were forced, and any who died were thrown into the sea. Many could not survive the trip due to different factors such as starvation, suffocation, and diverse diseases. Even punishments for failed rebellions increased the death toll of each voyage. On different occasions, slaves would try to revolt, although it was mostly unsuccessful. The consequences of this would include severe and brutal punishments. Some of the slaves would commit suicide by jumping off the ship. These rebellions also made captains of ships monitor the slaves closely, constantly searching for weapons among them to curb their revolutionary tendencies. Slaves who had been captured and transported from the interior parts of the African regions were held in castles and forts built by the Europeans. They were chained together and held in dark cells for different durations, depending on when the ships would arrive to take them through the Middle Passage. A large number of slaves transported across the Middle Passage were taken to the Caribbean, while some were taken to other parts of the Americas. When they got to America, they were advertised and sold as goods to interested buyers. These buyers usually owned plantations which the slaves would work on. The cargo ships would eventually continue to Europe with the remaining goods like coffee, tobacco, and rice, thereby completing the triangular trade. The triangular trade consisted of 3 continents: Africa, America, and Europe. However, Americans began taking direct voyages to Africa, circumventing the triangle to purchase their own slaves. The triangular trade was used to describe the 3 paths that the ships carrying slaves took. It involved 3 voyages, which started with the ships coming from Europe to Africa, then from Africa to the Americas, and finally from the Americas back to Europe. The Europeans usually exported textiles, alcohol, beads, cowrie shells, and guns to Africa in return for their slaves. Guns were specifically in high demand as African leaders used these guns in tribal and territorial battles in order to expand their kingdoms. This brought so much economic instability and warfare. While some states grew stronger and enlarged their domain, others were completely wiped out by their rivals. At the auctions in the Americas, slaves were inspected for deformities and flaws by prospective buyers. They were treated as mere objects and humiliated in the process. Young men and women were usually of high value due to their ability and fertility. This also affected the price for which they were sold. Africa supplied human resources in the form of slaves who were taken to the Americas to aid the production of sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were of great value in Europe. The transportation of the goods processed from the plantations made up the last part of the triangular trade. Although Africa supplied the greatest materials for economic development in terms of human resources, it did not benefit from the trade. Instead, it depleted the continent's population and provided the avenue for colonization years after. The transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on Africa's economic, social, and political development. Many African tribes and kingdoms lost their young men and women, leaving behind only the aged, who could not contribute actively to the growth of their society. Africa's population became stagnant and retrogressed. On the other hand, the European counterparts blossomed as plantation owners used profit gotten from their produce to sponsor the Industrial Revolution. Factories were built and so many industries prospered. West and Central Africa were at the core of the trade, but in the 19th century, slaves were also transported from Eastern and Southeastern Africa. Countries like modern-day Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo were the most hit by the trade. When these captured Africans were finally sold to buyers, they became legal properties of their owners, and this meant that they could also be sold alongside other commodities and services. Many slaves died just before getting to the coast and then into the ships that headed for what is termed the Middle Passage. The slave trade purged the continent of vast human resources, which the Europeans seemingly lacked. Different plagues like the bubonic plague had killed a number of the indigenes, and the need for human labor in their growing empires led to the hunt for slaves. Africans were known to be hard workers with knowledge in different areas such as agriculture, craftsmanship, animal rearing, and so on. They fit the perfect description for what the Europeans needed. On their arrival on American soil, they were stripped of their identity and given number tags for identification. Then they were sold at public auctions in the marketplace to farmers, owners of plantations, and other slave traders who wanted to resell. These slave traders would sometimes transport the slaves to interior parts of Southern or Northern America and also to the Caribbean islands. Even while they worked in the farms, homes, and plantations of their owners, slaves were still subjected to inhumane treatment. Women who were pregnant worked till they were due for delivery, and a lot of the children who were automatically considered as slaves died for malnourishment. Slaves were also more prone to certain diseases such as whooping cough, kwashiorkor, dysentery, convulsions, and so on. Before the slave trade began, Africa had a prosperous economy. Different empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Shanghai were among the most powerful at the time. These empires had structures, systems, and revenue streams in place that boosted their economy. Their success aroused the interest of the Europeans and led to tourist visitations that would later be detrimental. Many African rulers and merchants sold slaves to the Europeans for their selfish gains and interest. However, some of them resisted the slave trade. Different humanitarian organizations began to arise and contest the morality of slavery. This noble cause was spearheaded by a number of prominent abolitionists such as Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce. The cause was also met with great resistance as many slave owners who benefited from the trade fought back. Black churches also began moving the notion for abolition as more religious and humanitarian organizations arose. Many questioned the morality of the trade and the dehumanizing processes the slaves had to go through. The abolition began in Denmark in 1803, then in Britain, followed by other European countries and then the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade had been legally abolished, but continued illegally for the next 60 years. Christian missionaries were also instrumental in ending the slave trade, as they believed slavery hindered the growth and progress of the African continent. In memory of the millions of slaves who were traded in the transatlantic trade, March 25th was declared by the United Nations as the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Today, many of the slaves transported across the Atlantic centuries ago now constitute tens of millions of the Western population. They make up the African diaspora, which spans across the United States, the Caribbean, Brazil, and so on. Despite the abolition of slavery, Black people, especially in the United States of America, faced segregation and racism for many years into the 1960s. This gave birth to the rise of civil rights movements that pushed for equality and freedom. The most popular of these movements was the August 28, 1963 March on Washington. You can check out the full story in our next episode.